All right. Hi to my evidence-based students. So in this video, I'm going to tell you how to make sense of your meta-analysis and what to look for. When you're reading academic articles, you don't necessarily need to read every single word with a lot of scrutiny because you're reading strategically to find the most important information to help you answer your question or help you solve your organizational or managerial problem. In this case, let's say I'm interested in looking at the relationship between ethical leadership and ethical behavior. I can tell from my searching of the literature that this is most likely going to be an article that is pretty closely related to what I'm interested in. We see in the title that it says meta-analytic review. That means it's a meta-analysis. That's another way of saying it's a meta-analysis. And that means that they quantitatively aggregated the relationships between ethical leadership and its outcomes and moderators. I'm not interested in moderators because I'm just interested in looking at the relationship between ethical leadership and ethical behavior as an outcome. Another way we can identify if this article is something that we're interested in is by reading the abstract. For all of your articles, you'll want to read the abstract. It's a nice, pithy way to summarize what's going on in the study. So the abstract is there to allow you to have a sense of whether or not you should read this article in more detail. In this case, we see that in our abstract, again, we see good terms. We see ethical leadership and associated with beneficial follower outcomes. So this sounds like this is what we are interested in. We can also tell if we're interested in this meta-analysis by kind of scrolling down and looking to see if at least one of our variables in our research question is thoroughly described in the introduction. If for us, we're looking at ethical leadership and ethical behavior, we want to see at least one of those, if not both of them, pretty well articulated. Here we see, okay, ethical leadership, it's a whole section, a subsection. This is a good sign. What you'll want to do next is then start reading the subsection where you see the terminology used to describe your construct. If the terminology used does not pretty closely describe your construct, I would recommend trying to find another article. There are so many meta-analyses, there are so many research articles. Don't worry about not finding one. You most likely will find what you want. You can always ask me if you're not sure. But if you saw, for example, instead of ethical leadership, you saw leader behavioral integrity, I would not use that article for my research question because it's actually capturing something a little bit different. The definition of leader behavioral integrity will be a little bit different than ethical leadership. The way they study it will be a little bit different. And so it's not clear that the findings from a study on leader behavioral integrity would transfer over to one on ethical leadership. Again, because you have so many papers available, you might as well just find one that most closely matches your research question and uses the terminology in your research question. That's sometimes a thing that is a bit of a gap between the scientific community and people who want to use scientific research, is that the words used in the scientific community are really, really specific and they're not that interchangeable. And in the kind of non-scientific community who wants to use maybe scientific research to solve organizational problems, there's much less precision in wording. It's important to be precise with wording and precise with what you're studying from a scientific standpoint, but from the standpoint of using this research, it's best to just keep it consistent, whatever variables you choose. If you want to look at ethical leadership, great. If you want to look at leader behavioral integrity, great, but only do one or the other. And they should match your research question. The way you can tell, again, the terminology and the definition. So we have ethical leadership. That's all good and well. We'll read our definition in that section there, but we also want to make sure that this meta-analysis also looks at the other variable too in our research question. Ethical leadership scale, not interesting to us. Follower consequences, that does sound interesting to us. That's what we're interested in, right? Ethical behavior of followers. So what we'll do next is then kind of scroll around and see if we can find ethical behavior specifically. And bingo, what do you know? It's right here. They have a whole paragraph defining ethical behavior. You'll want to read that too. And we see that there's a hypothesis that tests the relationship in our research question. That's really important that you see that. If not, you may still be able to use your meta-analysis. Most likely they'll have hypotheses that state this though. Okay, so we keep going. There's a lot of other outcomes. We maybe aren't interested in those depending on our rapid evidence review, and we can just keep on going by. The next thing that we want to look for is, you may be interested in things like the population of interest, making sure that the population matches your research question in your Peacock terms, and other different methodological things that they did. Were they systematic about how they searched for articles? Most likely for meta-analysis, they will be. If you're interested in talking about publication bias, that's an interesting kind of thing that they can do with meta-analyses, which is estimate the number of studies that might be missing from the meta-analysis because they were never published. Sometimes things don't see the daylight and they never get published. And we can estimate those missing studies potentially using some fancy statistical techniques, but you don't most likely need to worry about that. The next thing we want to look for is a big table that will probably look a little bit like this. Often it's table 1, but it might be table 2, table 3, depending on the nature of the meta-analysis that you use. It will most likely be one of the first tables that you find. This table indicates the relationships, the aggregated relationships between ethical leadership and, in this case, a bunch of follower consequences. The table should tell you what relationships they're depicting and summarizing. The meta-analysis is a way of aggregating a bunch of individual studies to look at the overall effect size, the overall correlation between two variables across a large number of studies. And so one thing that they produce here is this table that indicates these correlations, that indicates the aggregate correlations. What we see here on the left side is the name of a bunch of follower outcomes. What we'll do is we'll kind of scroll down until we find the outcome that we're interested in. And then we can look over to the right to see all of this information about the relationship between ethical leader behavior and follower ethical behavior. Sorry, ethical leadership and follower ethical behavior. First, what we see is K. K is the number of studies that were aggregated. It's a little surprising that the relationship here between ethical behavior and ethical leadership only involved 4 studies, because this is a relationship that is frequently discussed, but apparently there aren't that many studies that looked at it. Although there are not that many studies, we see that the sample size is quite large. So even though the number of studies was small, we still have a pretty big sample size, 7,000 people in the aggregate across all 4 studies. And that's a nice large sample size. So we can feel relatively confident about this effect size. The next thing we see is this fancy P looking thing. And if you track down to where ethical behavior and this intersect, the number that we see is 0.61. The fancy P is a symbol for rho, and rho is an aggregated correlation. It's an average correlation across all the 4 studies. So we take all the different findings, all the different correlations from all 4, aggregate them, and we get rho. Sometimes you might see this expressed differently. It might be an R with a line over the top, R being the typical signal for a correlation, and the line on the top signifying that it is a mean. There may be other ways that they indicate this as well. Usually what you can do if you're not sure is look at the note in the bottom and it'll tell you what all the different symbols mean. A good table should do this. In this case, rho is 0.61. That's a pretty good effect size. It's pretty big. Most of the times in the social sciences, our correlations are pretty small, and 0.61 is a correlation that somebody would get excited about. we maybe don't care that much about these other numbers. We would potentially care about, or we do care about, the 95% confidence interval, this number that is kind of in the third to last row. And that says with 95% confidence, we expect the aggregate correlation to be between 0.68 and 0.73. Why this is important is we would want to check whether or not the 95% confidence interval contains 0. If it contains 0, then the results are not statistically significant. That means that the relationship between our variables is not statistically significantly different than 0, and we don't think there's much of a relationship. By the time you're aggregating correlations in a meta-analysis, often the correlations do not, the confidence interval does not contain 0 because the sample sizes are so large. But sometimes they do. And in any case, it's interesting to see how big we think that the correlation might be. So with 95% confidence, this is the size, 0.68 to 0.73. And that's a pretty big correlation. I feel pretty confident about this correlation. We'll talk more about effect sizes and statistics in our other classes, but this is just to give you a sense of what to look for, how to read your meta-analysis, and how to use what you're reading. In addition to finding the effect sizes, the introduction of the meta-analysis is probably going to be helpful for writing the rapid evidence review itself. In your write-up, you'll want to depict why your study is important, what the big picture is, and they have to do this too. So you can look and see in these introductory paragraphs how they articulated the importance of this topic, and that can help you kind of write your paper as well. You can use them as a citation in this process. The other thing that you'll want to use when you're writing the rapid evidence review is the definitions of your constructs. You'll want to describe and define your constructs in the research question that you looked at, using the academic literature that you found or using other citations that you found. It doesn't have to be academic, but you will want to use citations, and you don't want to just make the definitions up yourself. Draw on what others have done before you. So ethical leadership, we'll look at the definition here. Ethical behavior, let's look at what they say there too. And let's use this to write our description of ethical behavior in our rapid evidence review. So I hope this is helpful to kind of get you started, get you thinking about how to look at your meta-analysis, and could be a resource later when you want to look for more articles.